It was September 14th, 2023, just after midnight, mile marker 28 on Highway 61 south of Vicksburg, Mississippi. I remember the day and the place as if they had been etched into the back of my skull. I had been running regional overnight freight for the last 8 years, the kind of route that turns days into one long blurred night and makes the dark feel like a second skin. My rig was parked under the single sodium lamp that flickered above the old Magnolia stop, the lot empty except for a faded pickup and a silver sedan half hidden under a willow. I had my routine down to the minute: a paper cup of diner coffee, a quick stretch at the pumps, check the logbook, and be back on the road before the highway woke up. The coffee tasted metallic that night, like something the pot had held too long, and the radio was tuned low to a talk station that kept cutting out with static. I was supposed to be tired but tidy in my decisions. Instead, I noticed something small and wrong 100 yards away: a strip of blue light under the sedan's driver's side door, like a second street lamp had spilled itself into the gravel. I should have kept walking. I should have let it be another detail filed under odd and move on. Curiosity won in a way that still feels stupid to admit. I walked closer because the light was steady and human-made, and because the driver's side window had a smear of muddy handprints. If whatever was happening was mechanical, I could call it tow and be gone in 20 minutes. Instead, I dialed 911. That one choice turned a routine stop into a night I carried with me for months. When the trooper finally spoke to me in the lot, he said something I replay even now: "You did the right thing by stopping." I do not stop now at small lots on Highway 61 unless I can see a clear path to the restroom and the attendant is behind a counter with a radio in his hand. I still wake sometimes and hear the gravel under slow tires. I walked up the gravel lane with the smell of diesel in the air and the willow leaves tapping like someone checking a watch. The sedan's dome light was on, which was strange in itself because the engine was cold to touch. The driver door was unlocked part way, and a plastic grocery bag lay on the passenger seat. I knocked twice on the glass, and my own breath fogged the pain. From inside, behind the faint whir of the dash fan, a man answered my knock in a slurred voice. He sounded like someone who had been woken abruptly and then kept awake for hours. I told him I was stopping to get some coffee. He asked if I knew how to get to Interstate 20. I said yes. He said, "Thank you," and started the car and drove off in the wrong direction. That back and forth made no sense. I stayed because the headlights carved a shadow that looked too deliberate for a person who was simply lost. When 2 troopers pulled in 15 minutes later, the lot suddenly smelled like rubber and ozone. One of them, Hayes, carried a flashlight that sliced through the willow like a scalpel. The other, Deputy Morris, had the methodical way of someone who had handled reports where nothing obvious was a signal for everything. They asked where I had been and how long I had watched the car. I answered the truth in the halting way people do when they know minutes matter. They said they would check the dashcam footage from the patrol cruiser and the security feed at the Magnolia stop. I learned later that the video would be grainy and indexical in the way old film is. It held truth, but not narrative. That night taught me to listen to small noises, to watch for hands left hanging on a steering wheel, to notice the way a radio sticks on the same half phrase. The question that kept me awake was simple and stupid and heavy all at once. Why did a car that should not be running at 1 in the morning sit right where it was? And what had left those handprints on the window? I had been on the road since dusk, filling a schedule of pickups and drop-offs that left no time for lingering. My name is Jonah Reed, and I had started driving after my apprenticeship at a fabric supply warehouse in Jackson, Mississippi. My father was the kind of man whose hands always smelled of metal and coffee, and who taught me early that roads are not public spaces. They are networks of obligations and places to keep your head down. The routine fit. I liked the hum of the engine because it made thoughts stop. I did not like roadside legends, but I knew them. The woman who haunted the old bridge, the truck that found its way home empty. I had one small debt in town, a mortgage and a dog named Gus, who waited on the porch for me like on some days that mattered more. I had lost a brother to a combination of bad luck and worse choices, and that loss left a careful caution in me, a habit of checking behind doors and peering under trucks. The backstory that sat in me like a scar came from a night much like this one 3 years earlier, when I had ignored a flashing hazard light on the shoulder. I told myself this time I would not ignore the blue under the car. That memory was 845 characters long in my mind, the way a wound keeps tally. I can tell you the names of every bridge we cross and the faces of clerks who have become fixtures. I can also tell you how being on the road blunts a man and how a single small decision can sharpen him right back up. The first approach into the Magnolia Stop interior was a study in sound and smell. The fluorescent over-the-counter hummed, and the clerk, a woman named Claire Jensen, with a voice the color of boiled coffee, asked me what I wanted without really looking up. The air held cigarette smoke, layered with the sweet chemical of window cleaner and the diesel undercurrent that follows trucks like a shadow. I said I needed coffee, and I asked about the sedan. She wiped her hands on her apron and said she had seen the car pull in an hour before. The lot had been empty for hours before that. Claire named the driver as Tommy Bell, in a voice like someone delivering weather. She said Tommy was a regular and that he sometimes sat in his car and read until 2 in the morning, sometimes later. I asked whether Tommy ever left his dome light on, and she laughed softly and said of course he did. He liked the glow. That small domestic image made the scene feel less like a headline and more like a small domestic tragedy waiting to happen. I smelled the coffee, tasted it, bitter and burnt, felt the counter stick under my palm, heard a distant twin of tires on wet pavement, saw the fluorescent wash over the glass, and noticed the slight tremor in Claire's hand when she said the name Tommy Bell. We both listened. In the corner of the store, a radio said something about a wreck on I-20, and the station cut to static for a second. Claire named 2 other locals who might know Tommy, Marcus Turner and Pastor Lewis Harper. Those were the first names that later formed a net of responses around an event that was trying to hide. I knocked on the sedan's driver's side again, and this time someone opened the door and there was a voice that made my teeth ache. The man inside smelled of aftershave and something sharper that I later learned was rubbing alcohol used to scrub a wound. He had a bandage on his forearm, a jagged paper towel taped there. When I asked if he needed help, his voice snapped with annoyance and then softened. Our dialogue was quick, and then it doubled back and became longer, 12 exchanges that read now like a script of misdirection. He said he was fine. I said, "You look like you were bleeding." He said it was nothing. I said the dome light was on, and he said he liked the light. I asked if he needed me to call someone, and he thanked me and asked instead for directions to a road I knew but that did not connect the way he described. I told him the name of the road and asked why he wanted it. He looked away and said the answer did not matter. I asked his name. He said Tommy. I asked if anyone was with him. He said no. I said, "Are you sure?" He said yes. I offered to wait with him or to call a friend. He said no, and then asked if I could tell him what time it was. The clock felt absurd to mention. He then asked where I was headed, and I told him, and he nodded like someone memorizing a route. At the last exchange, he pushed his sunglasses up his nose and made a joke about the radio. He started the car and left the lot in the wrong direction. These 12 back and forths did more than relay information. They built a rhythm of normalcy that didn't match the small inconsistencies the way a cracked mirror does not show truth but fragment. When the troopers arrived, the texture of the night changed. Officer Hayes introduced himself in a voice practiced to steady, and then Deputy Morris said something under his breath about paper bags and the way people hide things when they have had time to choose their story. There were 6 main sensory notes that I can still call up for that scene. The high beam cut of the patrol light, the metallic smell of a gun belt, the coarse scrape of gravel under boots, the soft click of zip ties being checked, the low radio chatter from the cruiser, and the sudden absence of the coffee smell that had been carrying the whole stop. The troopers asked questions and I answered them. They asked for my license and registration. I gave them the documents out of habit, my hands steady but my throat dry. They asked me to stand to the side while they spoke to Claire and to Marcus when he showed up. Marcus Turner arrived breathless, a man with a trucker's cap and a face like old bark. He said he had seen Tommy earlier, that Tommy had been angry on the phone and cursing and then had calmed to hush. Pastor Lewis came late, his collar sharpened like a statement, and he said he had watched Tommy pray under his breath by the willow once when the whiskey got to be bad, and that Tommy sometimes clung to small acts of faith. Each person offered a tiny shard of context that made no whole. The troopers radioed dispatch and asked for a tow and for a cruiser to drive the road toward Vicksburg to see if the car would be spotted elsewhere. The initial intervention that night moved like a slow machine. It took 10 minutes to dispatch a tow and 20 for the cruiser from the state line to arrive zipped through the dark. In those minutes, the Magnolia stop became a perimeter that smelled of engine oil and clean sweat. The troopers secured the sedan and photographed the scene. Watched as Hayes lifted the dome light and took a photo, then slid his glove under the seat and found a folded receipt from a diner on Old Jefferson Road. That receipt would later be a thread in the story. Claire gave her statement, and Marcus and Pastor Harper both recited what they had seen. The dialogue between the officers and the locals that followed was exacting and started another cluster of 12 exchanges we would replay in reports. Hayes asked whether Tommy had any family in town. Pastor Harper said he had a sister out near Rolling Fork. Morris asked whether Tommy had been seeing anyone, where he worked. Claire said he did odd jobs and sometimes helped out at the church kitchen. Marcus said he had loaned Tommy money once and regretted it. The troopers asked me to wait for the investigator to arrive, and I found myself standing in that small bleached cone of light, feeling like someone who had been pressed into service. The lot had gone from sleepy to staged, and the script of ordinary life had slipped a gear. The night taught me that scene control matters, and that officers move not only with flashlights but with an economy of words meant to elicit small truths. The formal investigation that followed had a tone different from the immediate urgency at the lot. It was a slow accretion of records and small forensic details. The next morning, Detective Claire Andrews from Vicksburg called me and asked for everything I had seen, including the time I had left and a description of the sedan. Forensic technicians processed the car for prints and DNA swabs, and they logged the chain of custody in precise language. They dusted the dome lamp for latent impressions and took a swab from the bandage on the armrest. In about 300 characters of procedural description, the process was straightforward. Technicians photographed, cataloged, and numbered evidence. Swabs were placed in sterile tubes and logged. Every transfer from cruiser to evidence locker was signed. The state lab later ran those swabs for blood and epithelial cells and compared profiles to the national database. Those dry procedural steps mattered because they turned instinct into evidence. The lab report took 3 days, and that wait expanded the story into rumor. Local reporters from the Vicksburg Daily Gazette called Claire, and they ran a short piece. Car found idling after midnight raises questions near Highway 61. The piece was short and factual, but the comments section quickly filled with versions of the night that had nothing to do with method and everything to do with folklore. That tension between what can be proven and what is told in whispers would become a recurring motif. The immediate consequences were uneven. Tommy Bell was tracked 2 days later to a rundown rental on the edge of town by an officer who recognized the name on a mechanic's invoice. When they knocked, Claire the detective said, "There was only one person inside the house, a young woman named Sarah Green, who answered the door in a bathrobe and said her brother had left in the night. The EMTs arrived, and the press came within hours. The community reaction was swift and particular. I can name the people who mattered in those early days: Detective Claire Andrews, Officer Hayes, Deputy Morris, Claire Jensen the clerk, Marcus Turner the neighbor, Pastor Lewis Harper, Sarah Green the sister, and Dr. Victor Andrews the pathologist. Each person offered a different version, and each reaction narrowed the circle of possibilities. The town council called for increased patrols on the highway, and the Magnolia stop briefly hung a new sign that read, under smaller letters, "Safe parking, no long-term stays." The first headline the following morning was sharper than the facts. Highway 61 mystery prompts police search. The sheriff made a brief statement to the press about increased vigilance and about not jumping to speculation. That statement calmed and inflamed in equal measure. Linkage work began as detectives opened files and ran license plates and called friends of friends. They found a pattern of calls placed from payphones along the river road that matched Tommy had been seen alone. They ran the sedan registration and found an old salvage title that matched a car in a collision report from 2017 near Rolling Fork, where an occupant had been listed as unknown and 2 people had been injured. The investigators noticed that the sedan had a dashcam mounting bracket, but the card slots were empty. There were also references in county records to a man matching Tommy's name who had been arrested in town for a misdemeanor years earlier and who had a restraining order filed against him that had been dropped. I was asked to watch old posts in a closed neighborhood group and to forward any mention of the car or of Tommy. Detectives interviewed Marcus at length about money he had lent and about a dispute Tommy had had with a man named Devin Reed. Devin turned out later to be a cousin who had a short temper and a long list of unpaid tabs. The investigators were careful with language in public, but in private they triangulated timelines until a picture began to form that connected this one night on Highway 61 to at least 3 other minor incidents that read like variations on a pattern. A solitary car at night, a phone call at 2 in the morning, a person refusing help. There were many moments when tension rose and time stretched, and I learned to notice them as if they were knots in a rope ready to tighten. One of those moments came when the detectives drove me out to an abandoned lot 3 miles downriver where a tent had been used in a storm. The air was wet with river fog, and the willow branches left tiny wet kisses on my jacket. I remember the silence and then a sudden metallic sound as the detective opened a rusted toolbox. They found a child's blanket under some plywood. The first paragraph of tension I felt was the visceral squeeze in my chest. The second was the thumping of my pulse in the ears. And the third was the slow recognition that the blanket had a small patch of fresh mud. That moment was about 560 characters of acute sensory and psychic pressure. Mud cold under the blanket, the faint smell of baby powder that did not match the dirt, the flashlight beam stopping on small blood specks, the detective inhaling and holding his breath like a man who is reading a page of bad news, my hands suddenly sticky with sweat, and the realization that this case might be stranger and crueler than a single man lost in the night. Another moment of tension was the first time the state lab called and said a partial DNA match had been found on the bandage swab. The lead detective read the name, and I heard each syllable as if through cotton. The phone felt heavy in my palm. That moment lasted about 590 characters and ended with an instruction to maintain privacy. A third tension peak arrived when an interview with Sarah at the house produced a sudden change of tone. She began to cry and then said something about a man who had promised to leave town and never come back, and that the man had made good on his promise for 3 years before returning. That emotional crumple gave the narrative weight and lasted about 520 characters. A fourth came in the courtroom weeks later when Devin Reed, called to testify, refused to give a straight answer, and the judge banged the bench. The air in the courtroom tasted of old wood and formal paper, and the gallery shifted like a flock. That tableau was another 570 characters of high-tension detail. Names became anchors in the public story. The town talked about Claire Andrews and her methodical note-taking, about Officer Hayes, who had that particular way of leaning into a conversation, about Pastor Harper and his quiet sermons, about Marcus, who felt guilty, and about Sarah, who moved through the world like an open question. Other names floated like exclamation points. Tommy Bell as the pivot, Devin Reed as the edge, Dr. Victor Andrews as the calm voice from the lab, and Nora Lane, a neighbor who came forward with a photo from 2 years before showing Tommy at a cookout. Each person gave a detail that either filled a hole or made the hole bigger. The community reaction split into sympathetic and suspicious camps. Some locals posted prayers on the town Facebook, and others criticized law enforcement for not releasing more information. The newspapers printed mugshots and then retracted with corrections. That messy communal processing is typical of events that happen at night on roads that feel like anyone can claim them. The social pressure shaped the investigation as much as any forensic test. The procedural thread thickened as detectives obtained search warrants. They executed a warrant at a storage unit on the edge of Vicksburg and found a set of letters and an old camera whose film had been developed and showed images of cars on lonely lots at night. The search warrant affidavit laid out probable cause with phrases like suspicious activity and patterns of behavior. The technical part that mattered for the legal arc was that evidence had to be acquired, logged, and presented in court with precise chain of custody. That process was explained in short, accessible terms to the community in a press release that said evidence was collected and referred the public to the district attorney for comment. The district attorney later filed charges not for what people had feared initially, but for a string of property-related offenses and a count of unlawful restraint linked to an incident the troopers had discovered in old records. The charges felt small compared to the rumor, but they were real and they started the legal process. There were hearings, subpoenas, and then a grand jury review that led to an indictment on lesser counts, while an investigation for more serious charges remained open. The narrative built toward a climax that arrived in a courtroom, on a riverbank, and in the quiet between interviews. The showdown I will recount is heavy with detail. The courtroom smelled of old coffee and paper, and the fluorescent lights buzzed. Detective Andrews sat forward and recounted how the dashcam bracket and a pattern of phone calls tied Tommy and Devin to that night. The defense argued lack of proof and raised alternative explanations about borrowed cars and mistaken identities. The scene stretched across hours and tightened with each witness. There was a 2-paragraph burst of tension when the prosecution called Claire Jensen, and she described the last words she heard Tommy speak to someone on the phone the night before he was seen at Magnolia Stop. Her voice was steady at first and then broke. The jury shifted. The defense tried to cast doubt. The stakes felt enormous in the small court where a town keeps its secrets. Another subclimax occurred when a neighbor provided a recording of a late-night argument that had been saved on a voicemail. The recording was played in the silence, and it contained sounds low enough to be argued about, but emotional enough to sway a room. In total, the final burst of the case escalated the emotional intensity and produced a moment where the judge admonished the gallery to hold their reactions. The scene resolved not in a dramatic confession, but in a guilty plea to a lesser set of charges, guaranteeing probation and supervised release, while the investigators kept searching for stronger connections. The resolution left many of us unsatisfied, a legal closure that felt like a seam sewn over something that still moved. In the months after the crash of that nightlife, adjusted and split into before and after dates. 1 month later, there were small, quiet effects that felt like stitches. Sarah moved into her sister-in-law's house and began to work part-time at the clinic. The Magnolia Stop put its hours on a board and added a sign about calling for assistance. I noticed the sign when I stopped 3 weeks after the first night, and the sign looked new and fragile in the same light that had exposed everything. I drove that month with my windows cracked against the humidity, and I listened to the radio with a kind of paranoid attention. Community meetings were held, and the sheriff outlined plans for increased patrols. The DA issued a short statement that thanked the public and asked for restraint while reminding citizens that investigations take time. The emotional landscape felt raw and cautious, like a town waiting for one more small confirmatory piece. That first month, I wrote in my log a note to myself: do not assume closure equals safety. 3 months later, the case had moved from urgent to procedural. The lab had returned additional partial DNA hits from other scenes that tied to a man with a different name who had been in town 10 years earlier. That lead did not result in an arrest, but it widened the radius of attention. Detectives reopened several cold files and asked for tips. The Magnolia Stop had a new clerk, and Claire Jensen had written a short op-ed about community care that ran in the local paper. People started talking about how the highway had always had a seam of darkness, and now they wanted more light. There were meetings about a safe lot program allowing local truckers to check in on stops by radio. I went to one of those meetings and listened as troopers and clerks and pastors tried to design protocols. The discourse changed from rumor to policy, and that practical movement felt more nourishing to me than any fiery moral outrage. The community built a small registry for drivers willing to be called for rides and for safe parking. I went to one of those meetings and listened as troopers and clerks and pastors tried to design protocols. The discourse changed from rumor to policy, and that practical movement felt more nourishing to me than any fiery moral outrage. The community built a small registry for drivers willing to be called for rides and for safe parking. That 3-month stretch marked a layer of structural response that made the town less adrenaline-driven and more methodical. 6 months after the night at mile marker 28, the legal threads finally reached a quieter place. Devin Reed had been charged in a related case that implicated him in harassment and in an act of unlawful restraint in a neighboring county. The plea bargains and the hearings had thinned public attention. Detective Andrews received a commendation from the sheriff for thorough work, and I received a small letter from the DA thanking me for my cooperation as a witness. The Magnolia stop closed for renovations and reopened painted a lighter color with a new sign about community resources. The town still talked about the incident at dinners and on porches, but the big emotions had dulled into a practical memory. For me, the change was personal. I noticed myself driving more cautiously on Highway 61, checking mirrors twice, and giving myself permission to stop at rest areas with lights on, even if it cost me time. The epilogue of 6 months included the fact that Sarah had enrolled in a night class and was studying to be a nurse. There was not a cinematic finality. There was a series of administrative acts and small life adjustments that amounted to a kind of hard-earned repair. Throughout the whole arc, a few technical details mattered and were explained to the public to avoid speculation. For instance, the dashcam bracket recovered under the seat did not automatically mean footage existed. Older units require a specific SD card that records on loop, and without the card, no recording is stored. Evidence handling required the swabs to be refrigerated and logged and then matched by CODIS to existing profiles with specific thresholds for partial matches. Those technical notes were rendered to the press with plain sentences that balanced detail and accessibility so people could understand what investigators were doing without getting lost in jargon. There are small lessons that stayed with me from that night and the months after. I learned how rumor and official information interact. I watched how names and small gestures become the bones of a community narrative. I realized that the ordinary places on the highway can harbor stories that are not immediate crimes, but sketches of harm waiting for a pattern to hold them together. I stopped taking roadside lights for granted. I began to bring a little notebook on my routes and to write down oddities. I began to trust slow institutional processes even when they frustrate. And I learned that my brother's absence made me more likely to act on the edge of a decision rather than let it pass. If you are reading this and you feel the urge to say what you would have done in that lot, stop now and leave a one-line comment beginning with "I would have" or "I would not have." If you have a similar night that sticks to the ribs, start your comment with "my night" and give us 2 lines. This channel takes those notes seriously. Some of the leads that helped in our case came from people who remembered a detail and posted it months later. Your small memory might be the missing piece in another story. I read and pin the contributions that are specific and helpful, and sometimes even pass them on to investigators for follow-up. The ending is not a tidy moral in which the highway is safe and all questions are answered. It is something quieter. Sometimes the light under the door is an emergency, and sometimes it is a map of a man too tired to go home. In concrete terms, Tommy Bell avoided serious conviction for lack of direct proof of more violent crimes, but the increased patrols and the community programs sparked after that night reduced incidents of late-night solitary parking in known trouble spots. The Magnolia stop remains on Highway 61 with a new secure parking area and a plaque outside with a number for the local helpline. For me, the night changed a habit. I now refuse to drive through a town without making one real contact, a known face in a shop, and a receipt in my glove box. If this story caught you in the chest and you want more verified cases like this, consider subscribing and turning notifications on. We bring documented narratives, and we honor victims and survivors with care. The road keeps its secrets, but a community keeps watch. Remember this the next time you pull into a lonely lot at 2 in the morning. Light and names matter more than you think.